Wizards has printed a lot of Commander Precons since their inception in 2011, and including the Secret Lair Raining Cats and Dogs, and the 4 decks included with Murders at Karlov Manor, the total, by my count, is 118. They print so many, in fact, that if you're watching this video a month after its release, it'll already be out of date with the release of Universes Beyond Fallout on March 8th. The rate of Precons released has also increased exponentially in recent years, with 56 of these being released since 2022. I love Precons. I, and many Magic the Gathering players, think they are fairly consistently the best value product released, and provide a relatively low barrier to entry for new players looking to get into the format. It was where I started, picking up the Bedecked Brokers Precon from Streets of New Capenna from Orc's Nest in London. I quickly tore that apart, of course, but it gave me a lot of great staples for getting started. There has, however, been a trend recently of preconstructed decks getting mechanically more and more complex. Most perplexingly in Universes Beyond Doctor Who, what could very much be considered a pitch for new players to get into the game also carried some of the most mechanically dense lists I've seen from Wizards. I'm looking at you, timey-wimey. All that aside, I find the makeup of Precons fascinating. Particularly interesting to me is the community reaction when spoiler season rolls around and the lists get revealed. We all seem to become master brewers, able to pick holes in any element of a deck's construction and diagnose any potential issues before even playing them. So why is it then that so many of us don't seem to apply the same critique and objectiveness to our own brews? Even after the 3rd consecutive Commander night of getting mana screwed or sitting with no cards in hand all night? When I set out writing the script for this video, I realized something. I couldn't really just talk about the makeup of Precons without looking at the bigger picture. And to see the bigger picture, I was going to need to read a lot of deck lists. From there I could start finding the actual figures for what goes into a Precon, but where was I going to put all these numbers? This is a spreadsheet. You may have seen one once when your significant other and or accountant tried to explain to you the extent to which your outgoing finances were being committed to shiny cardboard. But this one in particular is now the repository of the numerical makeup of preconstructed commander decks, as well as the bane of my existence. So, without any further ado, let's get into it, my fellow dorks. How many lands do you run in your lists? 35? 36? More? I'll hold myself accountable here and say that I probably run less than I should, averaging between 35 and 37 lands per deck. We're going to ignore my Urza Artifacts list, which runs a slim 33. And based on how you answered the last question, how often do you find yourself missing land drops? I've found this being the case for me a lot less after more practice building, but I have also learned to put a much higher priority on card draw than when I first started out. Precons have had a wide spread of land counts over the years, with Commander Legends Reap the Tide going as high as 44, and Commander 2011's Political Puppets as low as 34. But I wanted to know what the average was from 2011 all the way up to now, and for that I would have to resort to the darkest magic of them all, maths. So, by going through every deck list of every Commander deck ever released, I came to a running total of 4,516 lands in 118 decks, for an average of 38.2711, a lot more decimal places. So rounding down, an average of 38 lands. Ask around your playgroups, and I bet you'll find that's more than most people run in their decks. So why is this? Well, returning to my earlier point about Precons being beginner-friendly, there's probably an element of consideration taken by the teams at WotC that lead to them maybe putting in a few more lands than the average builder, to avoid putting new players in that horrible position of having a bunch of spells in hand and 3 mana on turn 6 to cast them. They want to use that opportunity of an introductory item potentially creating a lifelong customable well. And if Wizards can show that level of care creating a play experience right out of the box, why do we as players not show ourselves that same love when it comes to pouring hours and hours into crafting our own lists? Please, show yourself that same love. Taking this one step further, I also decided to figure out how many ramp pieces the average precon runs. For this, I counted mana rocks and mana dorks, as well as cards that fetch or allow you to play additional lands on your turns, in addition to cards that generate mana like Dark Ritual or Jeska's Will, and cards that create treasures. And what did I find? On top of the average 38 lands per deck, we've also got 10.47 ramp pieces on average. Summing those together, nearly half of all precons are cards that generate mana in one way or another. I'm not saying precons are perfect. Far from it. But a great deal of them play incredibly smoothly and give you a positive experience right out of the box. If they didn't, how many of you would be playing Commander today? And more importantly, watching me, a disheveled weirdo with a hyperfixation issue, talk about it. And I know what you're thinking. It's all well and good saying that we should run more lands because precons do it and they seem to work, but how good are the mana bases included? Don't they just run more lands because so many of the non-basics they include come in tapped? Well, I present to you, in all its glory, the precon mana base. Doing some rounding, the lands in a precon are 54% basic, 24% non-basics that must enter the battlefield tapped, including tap fetches like Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds, and 22% non-basics that come in untapped if conditions are met. This, by WotC's metrics, is what the casual mana base should look like. It's beautiful, isn't it? Doing this calculation for each deck yielded some interesting results. It's not a perfect likeness, but if we use the percentage of non-basic, non-ETBT lands, we can gauge how good or valuable a deck's mana base is. Using this metric, the worst value mana base in a precon to date is in fact, as I'm sure many of you are currently yelling at your screen like who's that Pokemon, not Sliver Swarm, but in fact a tie between 2011's Political Puppets and 2021's Elven Empire, with a measly 1 land each in this category. The best performance here, and I'm ignoring Commander Masters Eldrazi Unbound because a colorless mana base feels a bit like cheating, are all 4 of the Universes Beyond Doctor Who precons, with every single mana base consisting of 50% or more lands in this category. Other IPs really get all the love, huh? So, having looked at mana base and ramp as a key tenet of deck construction, I wanted to take this further and look at some other categories in addition to this. I settled on card draw, believing this to be hugely important in deck construction, particularly in a singleton format, and removal, an interesting point of comparison for deck lists intended for a fun, social format. It was here I ran into a problem. These concepts are incredibly loosely defined. Is investigate card draw? Is ward removal? Yes? No? Maybe? Can you repeat the question? This confusion led to some dicey decision-making in terms of what constituted any of these things. I decided to include cards that gave you access to seeing and playing more cards from your deck. Conventional card draw, impulse draw, looting, cycling, and tutoring to hand all counted. However, things like self-mill in isolation, as well as recursion to hand, did not. I did include when these effects were bundled together, viewing it as essentially draw with discard. This got confusing during the course of analysing 118 deck lists, as I'm sure is no surprise to you. So in all of these loosely defined categories, allow me a margin of error of 2 cards either side, depending on different definitions, as well as the very real possibility that I just counted things wrong. Forgive me. So, taking all of this into account, I found that the average precon runs 13.53 sources of card draw, with the lowest being March of the Machine's Call for Backup at 4, and unsurprisingly, Commander 20's Cycling deck Timeless Wisdom running the most, with as many as 40 cards in this category. As I've come to build more decks, and more importantly play more games, I've found myself putting more and more emphasis on card draw in my lists. Card advantage, as well as the ability to find specific cards in your deck, is potentially the most important thing in this format, and the first thing you should look at tweaking if your deck is stalling in games. Yes, that is still true even if your commander is a Traxxas Grand Unifier. She draws you a lot of cards, but she is incredibly expensive and a high priority for removal once you get her out. You have been warned. My running definition of removal was anything that destroys, exiles without a flicker effect, returns to hand, shuffles into library, or replaces or removes a creature's abilities or stats, like Darksteel Mutation. I also included counterspells here, given they remove a spell from the stack. So, how much removal should you run in what is, if you're not playing CEDH, a social format? Well, obviously there's going to be a lot of variation depending on what your deck is trying to do and the colors you're running. And while you shouldn't aim to reduce other people's fun at the table by constantly messing with their game plans to an unreasonable degree, you are going to find yourself on the losing end of a lot more games than is proportional if you're not able to deal with other players' threats. Your own fun is also a factor in the social contract. It is all about balance. Highest in this category is, true to its name, Draconic Destruction from the 2022 starter commander decks at 24, while the lowest is Neon Dynasty Commanders Upgrades Unleashed with 4. Funny tidbit about this deck in particular, it is in fact the only precon that is not commander legal out of the box, due to an error where it included 2 copies of Mossfire Valley and no Nissa Voice of Zendikar, like it was supposed to. The average deck is running 12.87 cards that provide some form of removal, between spot, board wipe, counters, and all the rest. This seems like a good amount, as while it can really be a fields band for players in your pods if you're running a sack engine with Grave Pact and Dictate of Erebos, take this from someone who's done it, we are playing a game where the majority of cards are designed to worsen opponents' positions and get you closer to your objectives of ultimately winning the game. I'm sure most of us have played at one time or another with someone who swore an undying vengeance for us removing a 1/1, but Solitaire is its own game, and Magic thrives on interaction, so please run it. The cards printed in Precons have done a lot to develop the Commander format, as well as provide a lot of cards that see play at higher power levels all the way up to CEDH. This is particularly true of the 4-color decks released in Commander 2016, which included a lot of 2-color partner commanders which are still seeing a lot of play in the format today. Highlights include Thrasios Triton Hero, Vile Smasher the Fierce, Timna the Weaver, Tanner the Bloodsower, Crown, Ludovic's Opus, Bruce Tull, Boorish Herder, and Silas Wren, Secret Adept. Just a couple. Commander 19 also gave us Dockside Extortionist, and 20 gave us the cycle of free commander spells, particularly Deflecting Swat, Fierce Guardianship, and Deadly Rollick. Where Precons could be seen to have occasionally gone wrong, at least at casual levels, is where commanders have been introduced that could be seen to dominate their archetype, and reduce variability in the decks people build due to them simply being the best in that style of deck. Commanders that stick out for me in this regard are Atraxa, Praetor's Voice in Poison or Super Friends, the Dragon for Dragons, Edgar Markov for Vampires, Lathril Blade of the Elves for Elfball, and Gavi Nest Warden for Cycling, which Alex, aka Salubrious Snail, talked about in detail in their video, how WotC made cycling bland in EDH, which I highly recommend and will include a link to below. This contributes directly towards the issue identified by Jim Lepage in the 2024 State of the Format. To quote, "When cards do land in the majority of decks, they often seem to be cards that were designed specifically with Commander in mind. This does carry a benefit that newer cards tend to be more available and more readily reprinted, but it does run the risk of eroding Commander's charm and personality. While it's not inherently an issue to run any of these cards at all, Casual Commander is a format to have fun, and creates an environment where lots of cards that might be considered unplayable in other formats actually see the table. So we should all work together and do our best to make Commander weird again. I know I will, and I sincerely hope you're with me." I also want to take a second to talk about the positive influence Gavin Verhey has had on the design of Precons, starting with his own list, printed with that lovely secret layer treatment in the heads I win, tails you lose drop. This list stacks up incredibly well in all of these metrics, running a respectable mana base of 37 and 7 ramp pieces against an average converted mana cost of 3.0, with 15 of those land cards, just over 40%, being non-ETBT non-basics, while also packing 15 pieces of removal and 18 sources of card draw. It is also thematically, and having played against it, mechanically strong, and just top to bottom feels like a list designed with care by someone who cares. The influence is also super clear in the Doctor Who set, with well-designed and great value mana bases, as well as a bunch of really good card designs. Yes, I know I keep saying that, but it's true. And it's all over the Murders at Karlov Manor commander decks, which are rife with reprint value and feature some great themes, backed up by more well-balanced, coherently constructed mana bases. What I'm saying here really is, thank you, Gavin. While products are coming thick and fast, there is a really promising trend in recent precons that I hope continues into the future. Also, I want more of your or other designers at Wizards lists for secret layers in the future rather than just endless theme decks, please. So, with all of this cutting-edge research completed, what am I expecting you, the Magic community, to do with it? Well, first of all, if you're finding that your constructed decks are a little too powerful for the precon players in your pods, consider using these figures, particularly when it comes to tempo elements like mana-based quality and interaction like removal, as a benchmark for how precons are put together, and what levels you could tweak your brews to come a little bit closer to the power levels of pre-constructed lists. While I've not tried this myself yet, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below if you give it a go, and whether it turns out to be an effective method for balancing your tables. The second is this. If you're finding that your brews are underperforming, particularly if you're new and still finding your feet making your own decks, consider comparing your brews to these figures and seeing how it stacks up. We all love cramming as much spice as possible into our lists, but I think from looking at precons, we can establish a strong baseline for particularly the quantities of land and ramp that you should at least consider running. After all, you're not casting any 10 cost spells if you don't have 10 mana to cast them. Lastly, I am issuing this challenge to the community. I want to see you make your own version of the average deck. Using the figures at the bottom of this ridiculous spreadsheet, I want to see you create your own list. The rules are as follows. The easy challenge. Your deck list should be no more than $150 in value, with no single card over $30. Use any color combination you like, and it should consist of 38 lands, 10 artifacts, 6 enchantments, 16 instants and sorceries, 29 creatures, and up to 1 planeswalker. Moderate difficulty. 21 of your lands should be basic, 9 should be non-basics that enter the battlefield tapped, and 8 may be non-basics that can enter untapped. Include 10 cards that ramp, 13 forms of removal, and 14 sources of card draw. For all of these categories, you may add or take out 1 card either side. And finally, if you're really hardcore, the hardest level of this challenge. Conform to all of the previous constraints while also making sure your list has an average CMC of 3.72 plus or minus 0.1. If you decide to take up the gauntlet, share your lists as well as the difficulty level you've gone for with me in the comments section below, or at AngryGreenMTG on Twitter with the hashtag MTGAverageDeck. I'm going to endeavour to make my own list in this style, and if I get enough submissions, I'll share and explain my deck list, as well as go through and review some of yours in a future video. Have fun. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you come up with. This was a ridiculous undertaking. I've read so many cards. I see rules text at night when I close my eyes to go to sleep. On the bright side, however, this has yielded some really fascinating insights into how WotC designs pre-constructed decks. I'm going to share the spreadsheet in the description, as well as on my Twitter, so you can view it in your own time. And if I can ever summon the courage to look at these hallowed cells again, I will attempt to keep it up to date as new precons are released. I hope it'll serve as a useful resource for the wider Magic community, as well as a lasting monument to my hubris. Thank you as always for watching, and if you give me a +1/+1 and like and subscribe, it'll offset the -1/-1 I got from my sinister looking but kinda sexy doctor. See you next time. I'm going to go lie down.